Hello and a warm welcome to this session of readings from the Bhagavad Gita as it is. Today we are going to continue reading from the fourth chapter, which is titled Transcendental Knowledge. In the last session, we had read verses 16 and 17 of this chapter, and today we are going to read verses 18 and 19. If you will recall, in the last verse that we had read, verse 17, um, there was reference in the purport to what is karma, what is vikarma, and what is akarma. And karma basically refers to activities done according to Vedic injunctions. Vikarma means activities prohibited in the Vedas, and akarma refers to work performed for Krishna, Krishna's pleasure, and such work brings no material reactions, good or bad. So, this was actually told to Arjuna, these two verses were spoken to Arjuna because Arjuna was he didn't want to fight with his relatives because, according to Dharma Shastras, if you kill elders and those younger to you, and you know, and relatives and things like that, one incurs sin and one doesn't go to the heavenly planets. So Arjuna was thinking, by killing his grandsires and his guru and acharyas and all his relatives, he would incur sin and not be able to go to the heavenly planets. So, therefore, this is one of the reasons which he preferred for not wanting to fight the battle and running away from it. So, and going away to the forest to live a life of inactivity, where he would not perform his duty as a kshatriya, which is to fight, but he would rather live by begging. So, in that context, Krishna had explained that activity is the nature of the soul, and so, since it is the soul which activates the body, therefore, the subtle and gross body also cannot remain inactive. But since Arjuna was afraid of sin and things like that, so now the intricacies of activities is now being explained by Lord Krishna, and in this verse, uh, Lord Krishna will speak further on the intricacies of action. But before we begin, as is the wonderful tradition of our ancient civilization, let me first offer obeisances to the spiritual master and to all spiritual masters seeking their blessings. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. I was born in the darkest of ignorance, and the spiritual master opened my eyes with the torch of knowledge. I offer my respectful obeisances to the spiritual master and to all spiritual masters. And with that, it is time to read verse 18 of the fourth chapter. Karmanye akarmayah paschet akarmani cha karmayah sabuddhiman manushe sa yukta kritsna karmakrit. So, karmani akarmana yah paschit akarmani cha karmayah sabuddhiman manusyeshu sayuktah kritsna karmakrit. So the translation, karmani is in action, akarma, inaction, yah, one who pasyet, observes, akarmani, in inaction, cha, also, karma, fruitive action, Yah, one who, Saha, he, Buddhiman, is intelligent. Manushesu, in human society, Saha, he, Yuktaha, is in the transcendental position. Kritsna karma krit, although engaged in all activities. The translation to this verse is one who sees in action, and action in inaction is intelligent among men, and he is in the transcendental position, although engaged in all sorts of activities. In the purport, Prabhupada explains a person acting in Krishna consciousness is naturally free from the bonds of karma. His activities are all performed for Krishna. Therefore, he does not enjoy or suffer any of the effects of work. Consequently, he is intelligent in human society, even though he is engaged in all sorts of activities for Krishna. So, again, akarma means without reaction to work. So, again, to go back a little bit, it was explained in the earlier chapter, in the third chapter, that inactive activity is the nature of the soul, and the soul cannot be inactive. So, because of that, since it is engaged in the body, therefore, we also cannot remain inactive. Now, what kind of activity should we do not to be entangled in the cycle of karma? So, in this context, actually, also Arjuna had said that he didn't want to do fight in the battle. He didn't want to do that activity, which is his dharma as a kshatriya, because he felt he would incur sin, material reaction, and then would be entangled in this material world. So, here, therefore, Krishna had explained about the intricacies of action in the 17th verse. And continuing with that, he is saying that an intelligent person knows that activity is the nature of existence in this material world, because the source of the material world is spiritual, and the source of the body is what activates the body is the soul, and the soul cannot be inactive. So activity, everyone therefore must be engaged in activity. No one can remain inactive for very long periods. But an intelligent man knows how to act, how to do all activities, but in such a manner that one is not entangled in the karmic cycle. So, in this context, Prabhupada is explaining in the purport that a person who acts in Krishna consciousness is naturally free from the karmic cycle or the bond of karma, and his activities are all performed for Krishna, and therefore he does not suffer or enjoy any of the effects of work. So even here this is very interesting, because he doesn't have to suffer the effects of work, and he doesn't have to enjoy the effects of work. Why, the question might arise in our minds, why this is so. So it has been explained by acharyas that the logic is very simple. The whole idea of getting the human body is to not to continue getting new bodies after one ends the current body, but to be but to achieve but to disentangle oneself from this karmic cycle and the cycle of birth, death, birth, disease, old age, and death. So for that, if one does good karma, one the default setting is that one has to enjoy that the results of that good karma, and for that, uh, because only this material world is a world of good and bad duality, so one has to come back to this material world again in the cycle of transmigration, birth, old age, disease, and death, and and continuing to face whatever uh, a more and more degraded material world. So therefore, that is not very intelligent. So the intelligent human being, Prabhupada explains, he is intelligent in human society, uh, who, even though engaged in all sorts of activities, acts for Krishna, because such work is a karma. That means a karma means that work which has no reactions, good or bad. So even good reaction is not very smart from the highest perspective, because that also means rebirth. And then one doesn't know what is the nature of this material world is to degrade. So to take birth again and again in more and more degrading circumstances actually is inviting a lot of suffering. And more than that, uh, it means to move further and further away from the actual purpose of human existence, which is to understand one's true nature and one's position in respect to the Supreme, and how one should act in that respect. So then Prabhupada goes on to write that the impersonalist, one who does not understand the personal feature of the Lord, so such transcendentalists, although they are not materialists, impersonalists, they cease fruitive activities. That means they stop activities altogether, they withdraw from all activities out of fear, because they don't want to get entangled and get continue in the cycle of transmigration, because they know very well that the nature of the material world is that it will degrade. We can already see external degradation. We can already see degradation in the in the psychology, in the minds of the mindsets of the people. We can see people say society is moving, the human civilization, although it is technologically so-called advanced, but as people, as human beings, it is degrading. So that is the nature of the world, and that is why one moves from sattva or the golden age to treta, then to Dwapar and Kali. And if the degradation doesn't take place, then how will the new regeneration happen? So, and back to Sattva happen. So it has to be destroyed completely. So then, for that destruction to take place, the consciousness, the psyche, the mindsets of the human beings has to degrade. So, but if that happens, then again, the actual purpose of self realization also will not happen. And one will continue in this transmigratory cycle in increasingly worse circumstances, internal and external. Therefore, it is not a very smart thing to do. And so, although the impersonalist understands this and wants to stop the transmigration cycle, and therefore stops fruitive activities, not to get so that he does not get entangled in the karmic cycle, but then this is out of fear of not wanting to get entangled in the karmic cycle. And so the resultant action, so also that the resultant action may not be a block in the path of self-realization. For that, an impersonalist stops activities. But the personalist knows rightly his position as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and therefore he simply engages himself in the activities of Krishna consciousness. So rather than going against his material nature, a Krishna conscious person, a personalist, simply aligns his nature with activities that are, or aligns his activities with service to the Lord. And that way, karma doesn't, so that way his whatever activity he does becomes a karma. The impersonalist, he stops fruitive activities out of fear, and that path is more difficult, because there's a constant struggle with of not acting, when there may be the internal dynamics may be one where he would like to act. So for for a personalist or someone who's in Krishna consciousness, everything is done for Krishna. So one doesn't check one's impulse to eat, one eats, but one eats only prasadam. One does not check one's impulse to dance, but one dances um, to the tune of Krishna and or to the Lord. And one sings, but then that which is connected to Krishna. One does everything, but in a way that is aligned with and linked to the service of the Lord, or which carries forward service to the Lord. So therefore, gradually, this is less of a struggle than the path of an impersonalist who has to constantly check the desires, the natural desires, rather than align them with the supreme, and thereby transcend the lower nature and achieve the highest purpose of human existence. So therefore, he enjoys only transcendental happiness in the discharge of his service. So those who are engaged in this process, are known to be without desire for personal sense gratification, because everything is done for Krishna. So it is not done for oneself. So if one builds, rather than building a home for oneself, a huge home, one builds a huge temple, or rather than so in this way, acquiring wealth for oneself, one knows to use that wealth for doing what the Lord wants us to do. So in that way, uh, this activity, although from the external perspective appears to be same as one who is not Krishna conscious, is actually something that is gradually elevating the soul to progressively higher levels, and that way the soul engaged in the body is actually escaping the cycle of karma. And so in the context of what Arjuna was fearing, Lord Krishna is actually explaining, so if one links something to Krishna or does as Krishna wants, then it has no reactions, good or bad. So one is not entangled in the karmic cycle. So, in other words, Lord Krishna is telling Arjuna that I am telling you to fight. So, if you fight, you actually do not incur sin, because it is my will. Then the next verse is verse 19. And before that, just check what Purijana Dasa says about this verse. And Purijana Dasa says, inaction refers to devotional service or activities performed only for Krishna's pleasure. And therefore, Krishna's servants receive no material reactions for their service because they act as Krishna acts, without the contamination of seeking a reward for their actions. Action in inaction is the opposite. A sannyasi without transcendental knowledge of Krishna may appear not to be performing work, but as a soul he cannot avoid activity or the entangling results of activity. So, devoid of transcendental knowledge about Krishna, he must act, but he cannot act in Krishna's service, for he has no knowledge of Krishna. So, he is thus liable to all reactions. So, if somebody doesn't know Bhagwan or Krishna and just withdraws and becomes inactive, that also doesn't automatically ensure disentanglement from the karmic cycle, because activity cannot be avoided. So he has to perform some kind of activity. So at least he must breathe, he must eat, Purjana Dasa says, or he might step on living entities as he walks. So all these activities, since they have no transcendental basis, will definitely result in reactions, karmic reactions. But if it is linked to Krishna, that means if what he eats is offered to Krishna because he understands who Krishna is, has knowledge of Krishna, then the transcendentalist actually suffers no reaction. That is what is being explained here by Purijana Dasa. So every soul, Purijana Dasa continues, is unavoidably active. Artificial attempts at inactivity, that some people try, by going off to the Himalayas or things like that, lead to a further danger that of unengaged senses coupled with an impure mind. So, anyone who attempts spiritual practices while the mind meditates on sense enjoyments will fall down, even if such an unfortunate renunciate appears to be less involved in the world than a devotee. So here actually it's being explained that a renunciation has to be from within. So it is not enough that one appears to be renounced, but at the same time the mind is active in sense enjoyment. If such a thing happens, then the actual purpose of renunciation is not fulfilled. And therefore, it's better to be a devotee who is not apparently as renounced as a so called renunciate or an impersonalist, but actually from within there is complete renunciation, though externally it may not appear to be so, because the mind is not engaged for sense gratification. It is engaged in the committed to the service of the Lord. And so Purijana Dasa writes that Krishna further explains this verse in text 19, and we will continue that in the next video. So see you in the next video.